Housewife's confession. The day I realized I needed help. Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old mother of two living in suburban Denver, Colorado, has spent the last decade perfecting the image of the ideal housewife. Behind her Pinterest-worthy home and carefully curated social media presence lies a woman drowning in perfectionism, anxiety, and the crushing weight of unrealistic expectations. When a series of small but significant events converge on a single autumn day, Sarah is forced to confront the reality that her pursuit of perfection has left her isolated, exhausted, and losing herself entirely. This is her story of breaking down, reaching out, and discovering that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. It's the first step toward finding herself again. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or overwhelmed in your own home, you're not alone. This channel is a safe place for every woman who's lived through love, heartbreak, and the silent battles of family life. Subscribe now, and let's share our stories together, because your voice matters here. Chapter 1. The Perfect Morning. That wasn't the alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m. sharp, just like every other morning for the past 3 years. Sarah Mitchell's eyes snapped open, already calculating the day ahead, before her feet hit the hardwood floor of her master bedroom. Outside, the October morning air carried the first real bite of autumn through the slightly cracked window, and she could see her breath forming small clouds as she padded quietly toward the ensuite bathroom. The house at 1247 Maple Grove Lane was everything she and David had dreamed of when they'd first toured it 8 years ago. A colonial-style home with white picket fence included, nestled in one of Denver's most desirable suburbs. The mortgage payment still made David wince sometimes, but Sarah had convinced him it was an investment in their family's future. Now, as she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror, she wondered if they'd invested in the right things. Her reflection stared back, shoulder-length auburn hair that would need to be styled perfectly, green eyes that seemed dimmer than they used to be, and the kind of tired that no amount of concealer could completely hide. At 34, she still looked young, but there was something in her expression that hadn't been there in her 20s, something that spoke of carrying too much weight that wasn't visible on any scale. The shower was quick and efficient, followed by her morning skincare routine, 7 steps that had been recommended by a lifestyle blogger she followed religiously. As she applied her moisturizer, she could hear the house beginning to wake up around her. David's alarm would go off in 20 minutes, and the kids would need to be up by 7 to make their school schedules work. Downstairs, the kitchen was her domain and her battlefield. The granite countertops gleamed under the pendant lights, recently cleaned and organized to perfection. Sarah had always found comfort in the ritual of breakfast preparation. It was one of the few times of day when she felt completely in control. She started the coffee maker, a high-end machine that David had given her for Christmas 2 years ago, saying she deserved the best since she made everyone else's mornings possible. The lunch boxes came first. Emma, their 8-year-old, needed her sandwich cut into triangles with the crusts removed, exactly 3 baby carrots, a string cheese, and apple slices that had been treated with lemon juice to prevent browning. The apple slices were a recent addition after Emma had complained that brown apples were gross and had thrown away her entire lunch 3 days in a row. Michael, their 6-year-old, was less particular, but had recently developed an obsession with having fancy crackers in his lunch, which meant Sarah had to drive to the specialty market across town because the regular grocery store didn't carry the specific brand he'd seen advertised. As she arranged the food in their designated containers, Sarah caught herself holding her breath. It was a habit she'd developed without realizing it, this constant state of low-level tension that made her shoulders ache and her jaw clench. She forced herself to exhale slowly and tried to shake the feeling that she was forgetting something important. The sound of footsteps on the stairs told her David was up. At 36, her husband still moved through the world with the easy confidence that had first attracted her to him in college. He was a good man, a loving father, and a dedicated provider. He worked in software development for a growing tech company downtown, and his income allowed Sarah to stay home with the kids, something they'd agreed was important when Emma was born. "Morning, beautiful," David said, wrapping his arms around her waist as she stood at the counter. His voice was still rough with sleep, and she could smell the faint scent of his aftershave from the night before. "Good morning," she replied, leaning back into his embrace for just a moment before the mental checklist took over again. "Your coffee's ready and I put your lunch in the fridge. Don't forget you have that client dinner tonight, so I'll handle pickup from soccer practice." David released her and moved toward the coffee maker, seemingly oblivious to the fact that she'd just recited his schedule back to him like a personal assistant. "What would I do without you?" he said, but it felt more like a rhetorical question than genuine appreciation. The next hour passed in the controlled chaos that had become their morning routine. Emma appeared first, already dressed in the outfit Sarah had laid out the night before, a carefully coordinated ensemble that looked effortless but had required 3 trips to different stores to find pieces that met Emma's exacting standards while still being appropriate for school. "Mom, I can't find my lucky bracelet," Emma announced, her voice carrying the edge of panic that suggested this was a crisis of significant proportions. Sarah's mind immediately catalogued the possibilities. The bracelet, a simple silver chain with Emma's name engraved on a small heart, could be on Emma's nightstand, in the bathroom where she might have taken it off to wash her hands, or possibly in the car from yesterday's errands. "Check your jewelry box first, sweetheart. If it's not there, I'll help you look after breakfast." Michael thundered down the stairs wearing his school clothes, but with his shirt on backwards and his hair sticking up in 3 different directions. At 6, he was all energy and enthusiasm, approaching each day like it was an adventure waiting to unfold. Sarah envied his natural optimism, even as she moved automatically to fix his shirt and smooth his hair. "Mum, can Tommy come over after school?" Michael asked around a mouthful of cereal. "His mom said it's okay if it's okay with you, and we want to build a fort in the backyard." Sarah's mind immediately began calculating. If Tommy came over, she'd need to have snacks prepared. She'd have to supervise them outside, and she'd need to coordinate with Tommy's mother about pickup time. It wasn't that she minded. She loved seeing Michael happy, but every social interaction required planning and energy that she wasn't sure she had. "We'll see, baby. Let me talk to Tommy's mom first," she said, mentally adding another item to her growing to-do list. By 8:15, the kitchen looked like a hurricane had passed through despite Sarah's best efforts to maintain order. David had left for work with a quick kiss and a promise to text her about dinner timing. Emma had found her bracelet. It was in the bathroom, as Sarah had suspected, and was waiting by the front door with her backpack and her clarinet case for her lesson during lunch. Michael was making airplane noises as he finished his orange juice, completely oblivious to the fact that he had somehow managed to get cereal on his sleeve. "All right, troops, time to move," Sarah called, using the cheerful voice that had become her default setting. She grabbed her keys, the kids' lunchboxes, and her purse, mentally running through her checklist one more time. Emma's homework was in her backpack. Michael's show-and-tell item, a rock he'd painted like a ladybug, was in his folder. Permission slips were signed and returned, and everyone had everything they needed. The drive to school was normally a time when Sarah could decompress slightly, listening to the kids' chatter in the back seat while she navigated the familiar route. But this morning, something felt different. As she pulled into the drop-off line at Riverside Elementary, she noticed her hands were gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual, and there was a knot in her stomach that hadn't been there yesterday. Emma unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned forward to kiss Sarah's cheek. "Have a good day, Mom. Don't forget to water the plants on the back porch. They looked droopy yesterday." The observation hit Sarah like a small slap. Even her 8-year-old was keeping track of her responsibilities, adding to the mental load that sometimes felt suffocating. "Thank you for reminding me, sweetheart. Have a wonderful day at school." Michael's goodbye was more dramatic, involving sound effects and a hug that nearly knocked Sarah's coffee cup out of the center console. "Love you, Mom. See you after school." As she watched them disappear into the school building, joining the stream of other children starting their day, Sarah sat in her car for a moment longer than necessary. Around her, other parents were pulling away, heading to jobs or errands or whatever filled their days. Some were talking on phones, others were checking their schedules on their smartphones, and a few looked as tired as she felt. The drive home took her through the heart of their neighborhood, past houses that looked remarkably similar to her own. Well-maintained lawns, carefully chosen landscaping, and the kind of quiet prosperity that had drawn her and David to this area. It was safe, it was beautiful, and it was everything they'd wanted for their family. So why did she feel like she was suffocating? Back at the house, Sarah stood in her kitchen and surveyed the morning's damage. Dishes needed to be loaded into the dishwasher. The counter needed to be wiped down, and somehow there were crumbs on the floor, despite her efforts to contain the chaos. She moved through the cleanup automatically, her hands working while her mind began organizing the rest of the day. The grocery store needed to happen before lunch. They were out of milk, and she needed ingredients for tonight's dinner since David would be eating out. There was laundry to be started, beds to be made, and she'd promised to call the pediatrician about Emma's upcoming physical. The house cleaner wasn't coming until Thursday, so she needed to do a maintenance clean to make sure everything looked presentable. As she loaded the dishwasher, Sarah caught sight of herself in the reflection of the kitchen window. She looked competent, organized, and completely in control. The perfect housewife in her perfect kitchen, managing her perfect family's perfect life. But as she stared at her own reflection, she realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt genuinely happy. The thought came out of nowhere and hit her with surprising force. When had contentment been replaced by this constant need to manage and control every detail? When had her life become a series of tasks to be completed rather than moments to be enjoyed? She shook her head, dismissing the thought as ungrateful. She had everything she'd ever wanted: a loving husband, healthy children, a beautiful home, and the privilege of being able to stay home with her kids. Millions of women would trade places with her in a heartbeat. She had no right to feel anything other than blessed. But as she finished cleaning the kitchen and moved upstairs to make beds, the feeling followed her. It was subtle, like a low-grade fever that you could ignore most of the time, but that made everything slightly more difficult than it should be. As she straightened Emma's comforter and arranged her stuffed animals in the precise order that Emma preferred, Sarah tried to pinpoint when this feeling had started. Was it after Michael was born, when the demands of 2 children had pushed her organizational skills to their limits? Was it when they'd bought this house, with its higher mortgage and greater expectations for maintenance and perfection? Or had it been a gradual erosion, so slow that she hadn't noticed until she woke up one morning feeling like a stranger in her own life? The doorbell rang as she was folding towels in the hallway, interrupting her thoughts. Through the front window, she could see Linda Harrison, her next-door neighbor, standing on the porch with what looked like a casserole dish in her hands. Linda was in her early 40s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of put-together appearance that made Sarah conscious of her own hastily chosen outfit. "Good morning," Linda said brightly when Sarah opened the door. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. I made 2 batches of my famous enchilada casserole last night and thought you might like one for dinner." Sarah accepted the dish gratefully, inhaling the savory aroma of cheese and spices. "Linda, this is so thoughtful. You didn't have to do this." "Oh, it's nothing. I know how busy you are with the kids and everything. We mothers have to stick together, right?" Linda stepped slightly closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Besides, I wanted to ask if you'd heard about the Henderson family." Sarah's heart sank slightly. Linda was a wonderful neighbor and a genuinely caring person, but she was also the neighborhood's unofficial information network. Conversations with Linda often became exercises in avoiding gossip while trying to remain polite. "I haven't heard anything," Sarah said carefully, already regretting the admission. "Well," Linda continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, despite the fact that they were alone on the porch, "apparently Janet Henderson has been having some difficulties. My sister-in-law works at the bank downtown, and she said Janet's been in there 3 times in the past month, looking absolutely frazzled and asking about their accounts." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but wasn't sure how to redirect it without seeming rude. "I hope everything's okay with their family." "That's just it. Nobody really knows. Janet used to be so involved with the PTA and the neighborhood book club, but she's been absent from everything lately. Carol Martinez tried to call her last week, and Janet barely said 2 words before making an excuse to hang up." As Linda continued talking, Sarah found herself only half listening. Instead, she was thinking about Janet Henderson, a woman she knew only casually, but who had always seemed so composed and capable. Janet had 3 children, all involved in different activities, and she'd always appeared to manage everything effortlessly. If Janet was struggling, what did that say about the rest of them? "Anyway," Linda concluded, "I just think we should keep an eye out for each other, you know? Sometimes the people who seem to have it all together are the ones who need help the most." The words hit Sarah with unexpected force. After Linda left, she stood in her kitchen holding the casserole dish and replaying the conversation. Was she the type of person people worried about? Did she seem like she had everything together, or was her struggle more visible than she'd realized? The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine activities. She started a load of laundry, made the beds, and tidied the living room. Each task was completed efficiently and thoroughly, but with each completed item on her mental checklist, the knot in her stomach seemed to tighten rather than loosen. By 11 o'clock, Sarah realized she'd been moving through her morning on autopilot, her body going through the motions while her mind churned with questions she didn't want to answer. As she stood in her perfectly organized laundry room, folding clothes with military precision, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with her picture-perfect life. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. The grocery store was supposed to be a routine stop, but as Sarah pushed her cart through the automatic doors of King Soopers, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had been growing stronger over the past few months. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, and the sheer number of choices in every aisle felt overwhelming rather than convenient. She pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app, where she kept her meticulously organized shopping list. Everything was categorized by store section to maximize efficiency. Produce first, then dairy, followed by meat, pantry items, and frozen foods last to prevent spoilage. It was a system she'd perfected over years of shopping trips, designed to minimize time spent in the store and ensure she never forgot anything important. But as she stood in the produce section, staring at the wall of perfectly arranged apples, Sarah found herself frozen. There were at least 8 different varieties, each with small placards describing their flavor profiles and best uses: Gala for snacking, Granny Smith for baking, Honeycrisp for lunchboxes. When had buying apples become so complicated? "Excuse me, honey," an elderly woman said gently, trying to reach around Sarah for a bag of oranges. "Sorry to bother you." Sarah startled, realizing she'd been standing motionless in front of the apple display for several minutes. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Please, go ahead." She stepped aside, feeling heat creep up her neck. She was becoming one of those people she used to get impatient with, the ones who seemed unable to make simple decisions in public spaces. She grabbed a bag of Gala apples without really looking at them and moved on to the next item on her list: bananas for Michael's breakfast, though he'd been complaining lately that bananas were too squishy and he preferred the granola bars his friend Jake brought to school. Lettuce for salads that David rarely ate because he claimed he was too full after the main course. Organic carrots because Emma had learned about pesticides in school and now refused to eat anything that wasn't organic, despite the fact that the organic versions cost twice as much and looked identical to their conventional counterparts. Each item she placed in her cart felt like a small defeat, a reminder of how much mental energy she spent trying to anticipate and accommodate everyone else's preferences. When had feeding her family become such an exhausting exercise in mind reading? The dairy section brought its own set of challenges. Milk was simple enough, 2% for the family, though David had mentioned wanting to try oat milk for his coffee. But the yogurt aisle was a minefield of options. Emma liked the strawberry ones with the mix-in granola, but only the name brand version, because the store brand tasted weird. Michael preferred the tubes he could squeeze directly into his mouth, which made Sarah cringe every time she watched him eat them, but weren't worth the battle that would ensue if she tried to substitute something else. As she reached for David's preferred Greek yogurt, vanilla low-fat with honey, her hand trembled slightly. She stared at her own fingers, wondering when they'd started shaking during routine activities. It wasn't constant, just moments like these when she felt particularly overwhelmed by the weight of making the right choice for everyone else. Sarah? Sarah Mitchell? She turned to find Jennifer Walsh pushing a cart toward her, a warm smile on her face. Jennifer was someone Sarah knew from Emma's class, a working mother who always seemed rushed, but somehow managed to look effortlessly put together. Her hair was in a messy bun that looked intentional rather than accidental, and she was wearing jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Sarah's entire outfit. "Jennifer, hi!" Sarah forced enthusiasm into her voice, suddenly conscious of her own appearance. She'd thrown on leggings and her oversized sweatshirt that morning, thinking she'd only be dealing with errands and household tasks. "How are you doing? I feel like it's been forever since we've had a chance to talk." Jennifer's cart was noticeably less full than Sarah's, and she seemed to be shopping with a casualness that Sarah envied. "I'm good, just doing the usual grocery run. You know how it is." Sarah gestured at her overflowing cart, which suddenly seemed excessive compared to Jennifer's minimal selections. "Oh, I definitely know. Though I have to admit I've been cheating lately and doing pickup orders. It's such a time saver, and honestly, it keeps me from making impulse purchases." Jennifer laughed, and there was something genuine about it that made Sarah feel both comforted and inadequate. "That's smart," Sarah said, though the idea of trusting someone else to choose her family's food felt terrifying. What if they picked bruised fruit or milk that was close to expiring? What if they substituted items without asking, and Emma refused to eat lunch because her string cheese was the wrong brand? How are Emma and Michael doing? Emma seemed so excited about her clarinet lessons when she mentioned them at pickup last week. Sarah felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with anxiety. She's doing really well. She practices every day after school, Sometimes I have to remind her to take breaks. What she didn't mention was that Emma's dedication to practice often meant Sarah had to coordinate dinner around music lessons, and that the daily practice sessions had become another item on her mental checklist of things to monitor and manage. That's wonderful. I wish I could get my kids that motivated about anything other than video games. Jennifer's tone was light, but Sarah detected something that might have been envy underneath. They chatted for a few more minutes about school events and neighborhood happenings, but Sarah found herself struggling to focus on the conversation. Part of her mind was still running through her shopping list, calculating how long the rest of her errands would take, and mentally preparing for the afternoon's activities. When Jennifer finally said goodbye and moved on to the frozen food section, Sarah felt both relieved and disappointed. The rest of her shopping trip passed without incident, but by the time she reached the checkout line, Sarah realized her jaw was aching from clenching it. The cashier, a teenage girl with purple highlights and multiple ear piercings, scanned items with mechanical efficiency while Sarah loaded her purchases into her reusable bags with the same organizational precision she applied to everything else. "Will that be credit or debit?" the girl asked without looking up. "Credit, please." Sarah inserted her card and watched the total flash on the screen. $243 for groceries that would last less than a week. When she'd been working before Emma was born, that amount had seemed reasonable for a family of 4. Now, living on David's income alone, every grocery trip felt like a small financial crisis, even though she knew they were actually doing fine compared to many families. The drive home took her past the elementary school, just as the crossing guard was setting up for the afternoon dismissal. Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman in her 60s who'd been helping children cross safely for over a decade, waved at Sarah as she drove by. Sarah waved back, remembering how grateful she'd felt when Emma started kindergarten, and Mrs. Rodriguez had taken such obvious care to learn each child's name and routine. But today, seeing the school reminded Sarah that pickup was only a few hours away, and she still had lunch to eat, groceries to put away, and a house to organize before the afternoon chaos began. She also needed to call the pediatrician about Emma's physical start dinner prep so it wouldn't be rushed later, and figure out what to do about Michael's request for a playdate. At home, putting groceries away had become an art form of efficiency. Items were grouped by frequency of use and expiration date, with newer products rotated to the back of shelves and refrigerator space maximized through careful arrangement. Sarah moved through the process automatically, her hands finding the right places for everything while her mind drifted to other concerns. The phone rang as she was organizing the pantry, and she answered without checking the caller ID, expecting it to be David or possibly the school. "Sarah, it's Mom." Barbara Mitchell's voice carried the particular mix of affection and concern that always made Sarah feel simultaneously loved and judged. David's mother was a wonderful woman who'd raised 3 successful children while working full-time as a nurse, but she had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. "Hi, Mom, how are you doing?" "I'm fine, dear, but I'm calling because I'm worried about you. David mentioned last week that you seemed stressed about the house showing for potential buyers in your neighborhood, and I've been thinking about our conversation." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She'd forgotten about that conversation, a brief phone call where she'd mentioned being anxious about keeping the house perfect in case neighbors brought potential buyers by to see what similar homes looked like. It had seemed like a minor concern at the time, but apparently it had stuck with Barbara. "I'm fine, Mom, really. It's just normal homeowner stuff, you know? Sweetheart, I've been a homeowner for 40 years, and I don't think it's normal to lose sleep over the possibility that someone might see dust on your baseboards." Barbara's tone was gentle but firm. "David also mentioned that you've been working until late at night, reorganizing closets that were already organized." The conversation was heading in a direction that made Sarah deeply uncomfortable. She'd always prided herself on being capable and independent, and the idea that David was discussing her behavior with his mother felt like a betrayal, even though she knew he was probably just expressing concern. "I think David's exaggerating. I like having things organized. There's nothing wrong with that." "Of course there isn't. But honey, when was the last time you did something just for yourself? When was the last time you went out with friends or read a book that wasn't about parenting or home organization, or took a bath without timing it so you could get back to housework?" The questions hit uncomfortably close to home. Sarah tried to remember her last girls' night out with friends from college, but she couldn't pinpoint a specific occasion. When had she stopped making time for those relationships? When had her world shrunk to the boundaries of her home and her family's immediate needs? "I spend time with friends," she said weakly. I see the other moms at school events and neighborhood gatherings. That's not the same thing, and you know it. Those are social obligations, not friendships that feed your soul." Barbara paused, and Sarah could hear her choosing her words carefully. "I love you like my own daughter, Sarah, and I'm worried that you're so focused on taking care of everyone else that you've forgotten to take care of yourself." After the call ended, Sarah sat in her kitchen, staring at her perfectly organized grocery receipts, which she filed by date in a small accordion folder for tax purposes and household budgeting. Everything in her life was catalogued, organized, and optimized for maximum efficiency. So why did she feel like she was drowning? The house felt too quiet around her, despite the familiar sounds of the neighborhood: dogs barking in the distance, lawn mowers running, children playing in nearby yards. It was the kind of suburban soundtrack that had once made her feel safe and content. Now it seemed to emphasize how isolated she felt, even surrounded by the life she'd worked so hard to create. She walked through the house, seeing it as if for the first time. The living room was magazine-worthy, with coordinated throw pillows and coffee table books arranged just so. The dining room table gleamed under its chandelier, set with a centerpiece she changed seasonally, and placemats that were washed and ironed after every use. Everything was beautiful, everything was perfect, and everything felt utterly empty. In the family room, evidence of real life was more visible. Michael's building blocks were in their designated bin, but a few had escaped and were hiding under the couch. Emma's sheet music was stacked neatly on the piano bench, but Sarah could see pencil marks where she'd written in fingerings and notes to herself. David's laptop was closed but still sitting on the end table, where he'd left it after checking work emails the night before. These small signs of actual living should have bothered her. They represented the constant battle against entropy that filled her days. But instead, they made her feel something she hadn't experienced in months: a connection to the people she loved. Not the perfect family she tried to present to the world, but the real, messy, human family that actually lived in this house. She picked up David's laptop to move it to his office, and as she did, the screen awakened, showing his email inbox. She wasn't trying to snoop, but she couldn't help seeing the subject line of the most recent message: "Thinking of you during this difficult time." Her heart stopped. Difficult time? What difficult time? David hadn't mentioned any problems at work or with his family. Was there something going on that he hadn't told her about? She quickly closed the laptop without reading further, but the damage was done. Now she had another worry to add to her collection, another potential crisis to manage and prepare for. The afternoon stretched ahead of her, filled with the usual tasks and responsibilities. But for the first time in months, Sarah found herself questioning not just what she was doing, but why she was doing it. Was this really the life she wanted, or was it just the life she'd convinced herself she should want? As she started lunch preparation, a simple salad for herself that she'd eat quickly while planning the evening's activities, Sarah caught her reflection in the kitchen window again. The woman looking back at her seemed familiar but distant, like someone she'd known well a long time ago, but had somehow lost touch with. The realization hit her with surprising clarity. She was living like a guest in her own life, trying so hard to be perfect for everyone else that she'd forgotten who she actually was underneath all the organization and efficiency. And for the first time in years, that thought scared her more than the possibility of letting someone down. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. The afternoon pickup line at Riverside Elementary was a carefully choreographed dance that Sarah had perfected over 3 years. She arrived exactly 15 minutes early to ensure a good spot, brought a book she never actually read, and used the waiting time to return text messages and plan the evening's activities. Today, however, as she sat in her SUV, watching other parents chat in small groups outside their cars, she felt like an observer rather than a participant. Jennifer Walsh was laughing with 2 other mothers near the playground, their conversation animated and relaxed. Sarah recognized the feeling of camaraderie from her own past, but it seemed to exist behind glass now, visible but unreachable. When had she stopped joining those casual conversations? When had the other parents stopped trying to include her? Emma emerged from the building at 3:20, exactly on schedule, her backpack properly zipped and her clarinet case held carefully in both hands. She slid into the back seat with the efficiency of someone following a well-established routine. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, checking her rearview mirror as she pulled out of the pickup line. "It was okay. Mrs. Peterson said I played really well during music class today, and Tommy asked if I wanted to be his partner for the science project next week." Emma's voice carried the satisfied tone of someone who'd navigated their day successfully. "That's wonderful. What's the science project about?" We have to build something that demonstrates simple machines. Tommy wants to make a pulley system, but I think a lever would be more interesting. Emma had inherited David's logical approach to problem solving, and Sarah felt the familiar pride mixed with concern about her daughter's tendency toward perfectionism. They were stopped at a red light when Emma's next comment hit like a physical blow. "Mum, why do you always look so sad when you think we can't see you?" Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean, baby? Like when you're making lunch in the morning, or when you're folding clothes, or when you think we're not watching TV but I can still see you from the kitchen. You get this look on your face like you're really, really tired, but not the kind of tired that sleep fixes." The observation was delivered with the matter-of-fact honesty that children possessed before they learned to soften difficult truths. Sarah felt exposed, as if her 8-year-old daughter had seen through her carefully maintained facade with devastating accuracy. "I'm not sad, Emma. I'm just concentrated on getting things done. You know how I like to make sure everything is perfect for our family. But that's what I mean. You always look worried about making things perfect, like something bad will happen if you don't do everything exactly right. Daddy doesn't look like that when he's working." Before Sarah could respond, they arrived at Michael's after-school care program. The transition from heavy conversation to cheerful pick-up routine felt jarring, but Sarah forced herself to switch gears. Michael bounded toward the car with his usual enthusiasm, his hair disheveled and his shirt somehow covered in what looked like finger paint, despite the fact that he was supposed to have been doing homework. "Mom, guess what? We got to paint pictures of our families today, and I made you look really tall because you always reach the high shelves for me." He climbed into his booster seat, still chattering excitedly about his day. "That sounds wonderful, buddy. Did you remember to put your homework in your folder?" "Oh," Michael's face fell slightly. "I think I forgot to finish the math worksheet, but it's okay because Mrs. Collins said we could finish it tomorrow if we didn't have time today." Sarah felt the familiar spike of anxiety that accompanied any deviation from routine. Michael's homework was supposed to be completed during after-school care, which meant her evening schedule would now need to accommodate additional math practice. It wasn't a major crisis, but it was one more ball to juggle in an increasingly complex routine. The drive home included the usual negotiations about snacks, screen time, and tomorrow's activities. Emma wanted to practice clarinet before dinner, which meant Sarah would need to manage Michael's energy level so he wouldn't interrupt his sister's practice time. Michael wanted to show her his painted picture, which was apparently drying in his classroom and would be sent home tomorrow. Both children needed baths tonight because Emma had gym class tomorrow, and Michael had somehow acquired an unknown substance under his fingernails. At home, the afternoon routine began with the precision of a military operation. Backpacks were unpacked and contents sorted. Homework, permission slips, and art projects each went to their designated locations. Emma's clarinet needed to be assembled and her music stand adjusted to the right height. Michael's after-school snack required careful consideration of his sugar intake so it wouldn't interfere with dinner appetite, but would provide enough energy to prevent the pre-dinner meltdown that occurred when he got too hungry. Sarah moved through these tasks automatically, but Emma's earlier observation echoed in her mind. Did she really look sad when she thought no one was watching? Had her children been observing her struggle without her realizing it? As Emma began her clarinet practice, the familiar sound of scales and simple melodies filled the house. Normally, Sarah found the music soothing, a sign that her daughter was developing discipline and pursuing excellence. Today, however, the repetitive exercises sounded like a metaphor for her own life. The same patterns played over and over, technically correct, but somehow lacking in joy. Michael settled at the kitchen table with his coloring books, while Sarah began dinner preparation. Tonight's menu was herb-crusted chicken breast with roasted vegetables and rice pilaf, a meal that required precise timing and multiple cooking methods. She'd planned it 3 days ago, shopped for the ingredients yesterday, and mentally rehearsed the preparation schedule during her morning coffee. But as she seasoned the chicken and preheated the oven, Sarah realized she was going through the motions without any real engagement. When had cooking become just another task to be completed rather than an expression of care for her family? When had she stopped tasting the food she prepared, instead evaluating it only for its nutritional balance and visual presentation? The phone rang as she was arranging vegetables on the baking sheet. David's name appeared on the caller ID, and she answered while continuing to work. "Hey, how's your day going?" His voice carried the slightly distracted tone that meant he was probably still looking at his computer screen while talking. "Fine. Just getting dinner started. How was your client meeting?" "Actually, that's why I'm calling. The meeting ran long and now they want to extend it into dinner. I know I said I'd be home by 6, but it looks like I won't make it until after 8. Sarah felt something snap inside her chest. The carefully orchestrated evening she'd planned, dinner at 6, baths by 7, bedtime stories, and everyone settled by 8:30, crumbled instantly. David, I planned this whole meal around your schedule. The chicken will be overcooked if I keep it warm for 2 hours. I'm sorry, babe. I know it's frustrating, but this client represents a huge opportunity for the company. Can't you just adjust dinner time? The question revealed how little he understood about the complex choreography of their evening routine. Adjusting dinner time meant adjusting everything else. Emma's practice schedule, Michael's bath time, homework completion, and the careful balance of activities that kept both children cooperative until bedtime. It's not just about dinner, David. Emma has homework to finish, Michael still needs to complete his math worksheet, and they both need baths tonight. If we eat late, everything gets pushed back and then they're overtired and cranky tomorrow. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Sarah could almost hear him calculating whether this was worth arguing about. Look, I understand it's inconvenient, but sometimes work has to come first. You're great at adapting. I know you'll figure it out. After he hung up, Sarah stood in her kitchen holding her phone and staring at the partially prepared meal. She could feel tears threatening, which seemed ridiculous. It was just dinner. People dealt with schedule changes all the time. Why did this feel like such an insurmountable crisis? Mom, is everything okay? Emma had stopped practicing and was standing in the kitchen doorway, her clarinet still in her hands. Sarah forced a smile. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Daddy's running late, so we're going to have a change of plans for dinner. Are you sure you're okay? You look like you're going to cry. The concern in her daughter's voice was the final straw. Sarah realized that her children were becoming caretakers of her emotional state, monitoring her reactions and adjusting their own behavior to accommodate her stress. That wasn't fair to them, and it wasn't the kind of mother she wanted to be. You know what? Let's do something different tonight. The words came out before she'd fully thought them through, but as soon as she said them, she felt a tiny spark of something that might have been excitement. Different how? Emma asked, though there was curiosity rather than anxiety in her voice. Let's have breakfast for dinner. Pancakes, scrambled eggs, maybe some bacon. We can eat in the living room and watch a movie while we eat. Michael appeared as if summoned by the mention of pancakes. Really? We can eat on the couch. What about the no food in the living room rule? Sarah looked at her children's faces, both showing cautious hope that this might actually happen. When had she become so rigid that the idea of eating pancakes in the living room felt revolutionary? Rules can be bent sometimes. Tonight feels like a good time for pancake dinner and a family movie. The next hour transformed the evening from a precisely managed routine into something resembling actual fun. Emma helped measure ingredients, while Michael stood on his step stool and stirred the pancake batter with intense concentration. Sarah let them add chocolate chips to half the batch, even though it meant they'd have sugar right before bedtime. As they cooked together, Sarah noticed things she'd been missing in her rush to maintain efficiency. Emma hummed while she worked, unconsciously echoing the scales she'd been practicing. Michael made up a song about pancakes that involved sound effects and elaborate gestures. Both children seemed more relaxed than they'd been in weeks, as if her decision to abandon the schedule had given them permission to simply be kids. They carried their plates into the living room and settled on the couch together to watch The Princess Bride, a movie that Emma claimed was too old for her, but that she secretly loved. As they ate pancakes with their fingers and laughed at the sword-fighting scenes, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten: contentment. But the feeling was short-lived. As the movie progressed, Sarah's mind began cataloguing all the things that weren't getting done. The dishes in the kitchen, the bath schedule that was now completely disrupted, tomorrow's lunch preparation that usually happened after dinner, the load of laundry that needed to be switched to the dryer. "Mom, you're doing it again," Emma said quietly, not taking her eyes off the television screen. "Doing what?" "That thing where you're here but you're not really here. Where you're thinking about all the stuff you think you have to do instead of just watching the movie with us." The observation was delivered without judgment, but it hit Sarah harder than any criticism could have. Her daughter was right. Even during this moment of spontaneous joy, she couldn't fully disconnect from her mental to-do list. When had her brain become so rigidly programmed that she couldn't enjoy pancakes with her children without mentally reorganizing her evening schedule? "You're right," Sarah admitted. "I'm sorry. Sometimes it's hard for me to stop thinking about everything that needs to be done." "But why?" Michael asked, abandoning his pancake to turn and face her fully. Like, what happens if the dishes don't get washed tonight? Do they disappear? Do we get in trouble? The question was so innocent and so logical that Sarah felt embarrassed by how complicated she'd made something so simple. No, nothing bad happens. I like things to be neat and organized. But you can do the dishes tomorrow, right? They'll still be there. Out of the mouths of babes. Sarah pulled both children closer to her on the couch, suddenly overwhelmed by love for these wise little people who seemed to understand life better than she did. They finished the movie in comfortable silence, the children eventually falling asleep against Sarah's sides. She sat there for a long time after the credits rolled, listening to their steady breathing and feeling their warm weight against her. This was what mattered, not the perfectly executed schedule or the spotless kitchen, but these quiet moments of connection. When David finally arrived home at 8:45, he found them still on the couch, Sarah reading quietly while the children dozed. He looked surprised by the scene, dishes still on the coffee table, pancake batter bowl still on the kitchen counter, and his usually perfectly organized wife sitting peacefully in what he probably saw as chaos. "How did everything go?" he asked, keeping his voice low to avoid waking the children. "It was actually really nice. We had pancakes for dinner and watched a movie." David looked around the living room, taking in the evidence of their unconventional evening. "I'm sorry I missed it, and I'm sorry about dinner. I know it messed up your plans." For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she could be completely honest with him. "David, I think my plans have been messing up our life." He sat down on the edge of the coffee table facing her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've been so focused on managing every detail perfectly that I've forgotten why any of it matters. Tonight, when you called and everything went off schedule, I almost had a breakdown over chicken dinner. That's not normal." David was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the soft lamplight. "I've been worried about you," he admitted. "You seem so stressed all the time, and I wasn't sure how to help without making it worse." "I think I need help, David. Not just with the housework or the kids' schedules, but real help. I think something's wrong with how I'm handling everything, and I don't know how to fix it by myself." The admission felt both terrifying and liberating. For months, she'd been trying to maintain the illusion that she had everything under control, that she was the perfect wife and mother who could handle anything. Saying out loud that she needed help felt like admitting failure, but it also felt like the first honest thing she'd said in a long time. David reached over and took her hand. "What kind of help do you think would be most useful?" "I don't know yet. Maybe talking to someone who can help me figure out why I feel like I'm drowning in my own life. Maybe learning how to let go of some of this need to control everything perfectly." As they carried the sleeping children upstairs to bed, leaving the dishes for tomorrow and abandoning the usual bedtime routine, Sarah felt something shift inside her. It was subtle, like the first warm breeze after a long winter, but it was definitely there. Hope. The evening had shown her that life didn't fall apart when plans changed, that her children were happier when she was present rather than perfect, and that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the first step toward finding herself again. Later that night, as she lay in bed listening to David's steady breathing beside her, Sarah made a mental note that felt different from her usual to-do lists. Tomorrow, she would start making phone calls, not to schedule playdates or doctor appointments or household maintenance, but to find someone who could help her understand why she'd lost herself in the pursuit of perfect motherhood. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without mentally reviewing the next day's schedule. Instead, she thought about the sound of her children laughing during dinner and the possibility that there might be a way to feel that joy more often. Chapter 4. Finding the Courage to Heal. The business card had been sitting on Sarah's kitchen counter for 3 days, moved from spot to spot as she went through her morning routine, but never quite making it to the trash or to her purse. Dr. Elena Vasquez, licensed clinical social worker specializing in anxiety and life transitions. The referral had come from her pediatrician during Emma's routine checkup, mentioned casually when Sarah had asked too many detailed questions about Emma's sleep patterns and whether her recent preference for wearing the same outfit multiple times per week indicated underlying anxiety. "Actually, Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Patterson had said gently, "children often reflect the stress levels in their household. Have you considered that Emma might be picking up on some anxiety from the adults around her?" The question had felt like an accusation at the time, but as the days passed, Sarah found herself returning to it. Was her own anxiety affecting her children? Were they walking on eggshells around her emotional state, trying to be perfect so they wouldn't add to her stress? This morning, as she stood in her kitchen at 6 a.m. staring at Dr. Vasquez's card while her coffee brewed. Sarah realized she'd been having the same internal argument for 72 hours. She'd pick up the card, dial the first 3 numbers, then hang up and find something else that urgently needed her attention. The cycle was exhausting and familiar, the same pattern of approach and avoidance that characterized so many aspects of her life. The house was quiet around her, David and the children still sleeping. This was normally her favorite time of day, when she could move through her morning routine without interruption or negotiation. But lately, these early morning moments had become a time when her thoughts turned inward, when the busyness couldn't quite drown out the growing awareness that something fundamental needed to change. She picked up her phone and dialed before she could talk herself out of it again. "Good morning, Dr. Vasquez's office. This is Maria speaking." The receptionist's voice was warm and professional, with a slight accent that reminded Sarah of her college roommate's grandmother, who had always made everyone feel welcome in her home. "Hi, I'm calling to ask about scheduling an appointment with Dr. Vasquez." Sarah's voice sounded strange to her own ears, formal and uncertain. "Of course. Are you looking for individual therapy or couples counseling?" "Individual, I think. I'm not really sure what I need, to be honest." "That's perfectly normal. Dr. Vasquez offers initial consultation appointments where you can discuss what brings you to therapy and what your goals might be. Would you like to schedule something like that?" Sarah found herself nodding, even though Maria couldn't see her. "Yes, that sounds good. When is she available?" "She has an opening this Friday at 2 p.m. or next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Which would work better for you?" Friday at 2 p.m. meant rearranging her entire afternoon schedule. The children would be in school, but she had planned to use that time for grocery shopping and meal prep for the weekend. Tuesday at 10 a.m. conflicted with nothing except her usual routine of household tasks that could theoretically be moved to another day. "Friday at 2 p.m. would be great," she heard herself saying, choosing the option that would require more adjustment, as if the inconvenience would make her less likely to change her mind. After she hung up, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her coffee and really looked at her calendar for the first time in months. Every day was blocked out in 30-minute increments, with color-coded entries for different types of activities: blue for household tasks, green for children's activities, red for appointments, yellow for social obligations. There was no color designated for anything that was purely for her own well-being or enjoyment. When had her life become so regimented that scheduling time to address her own mental health felt revolutionary? The rest of the week passed with heightened awareness of her own patterns. She noticed how her shoulders tensed when Emma couldn't find her favorite socks, how her breathing became shallow when David mentioned that his mother wanted to visit next weekend, how her jaw clenched when Michael spilled juice on his homework and they had to print out a new copy. She also began noticing moments when these reactions seemed disproportionate to the actual problems. Socks could be found or substituted. David's mother's visits were always pleasant, even if they required extra preparation. Homework could be reprinted in less than 5 minutes. None of these were genuine crises, yet her body responded to them as if they were life-threatening emergencies. On Thursday night, as she was reviewing her mental checklist before bed, Sarah realized she was dreading the therapy appointment almost as much as she was looking forward to it. What if Dr. Vasquez concluded that Sarah's problems were trivial, the complaints of a privileged woman who had nothing real to worry about? What if she suggested changes that would require Sarah to be less attentive to her family's needs? What if the solution involved medication or major lifestyle changes, or admitting things about herself that she wasn't ready to face? "You're doing that thing again," David said, looking up from his book. "What thing?" "That thing where you're physically present but mentally running through every possible scenario for something that hasn't happened yet." His tone was gentle, but there was concern in his eyes. "Want to talk about what's on your mind?" Sarah had been keeping the therapy appointment to herself, not because she wanted to hide it, but because she wasn't sure how to explain her decision without making it sound like a criticism of their family life. How could she tell David that she needed professional help to cope with the life they'd built together? "I made an appointment to talk to someone, a therapist, tomorrow afternoon." David closed his book and gave her his full attention. "That's good, Sarah. I'm glad you're doing that." "Are you? I keep wondering if this means I'm failing at something I should be able to handle on my own." "Honey, you've been carrying the mental load for this entire family for years. You remember every appointment, every preference, every schedule conflict, every social obligation. You organize our lives so well that the rest of us can just show up and everything works perfectly. That's not failing. That's incredibly demanding work that would exhaust anyone. The validation felt both comforting and overwhelming. Sarah had never thought of her household management as work in the traditional sense, but David was right that it required constant mental energy and emotional labor. I just don't want to be the kind of person who can't handle normal family life without professional help. Sarah, what about our life feels normal to you? We have schedules that would make corporate executives jealous. You track more data about our daily routines than most businesses track about their operations, and you haven't taken a day off from managing our household in 8 years. That's not normal. That's superhuman, and it's not sustainable. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Colorado, the kind of day that made everyone want to spend time outdoors before winter settled in earnest. Sarah dropped the children at school and found herself with 3 hours before her appointment, time that would normally be filled with errands and household tasks. Instead, she drove to Cherry Creek State Park and walked the trails she hadn't visited since before Emma was born. The path wound around a small lake, bordered by cottonwoods that were just beginning to turn yellow. Other walkers nodded as they passed. Retirees with dogs, young mothers pushing jogging strollers, a few people who, like her, seemed to be walking simply for the sake of moving through the world at a slower pace. As she walked, Sarah tried to remember the last time she'd done something purely for pleasure, without any practical purpose or goal beyond enjoyment. The question was harder to answer than it should have been. Even her reading was usually focused on parenting books or home organization guides. Her cooking was driven by nutrition and family preferences rather than creativity or personal taste. When had she stopped being a person with interests and become just a manager of other people's lives? Dr. Vasquez's office was in a converted house in the Highlands neighborhood, with a waiting room that felt more like someone's comfortable living room than a medical facility. The walls were painted in warm earth tones, with artwork that looked like it had been chosen for emotional resonance rather than professional decoration. Sarah found herself actually relaxing as she waited, which felt like a small miracle given how anxious she'd been about the appointment. Dr. Vasquez herself was probably in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and the kind of calm presence that made immediate conversation feel natural rather than forced. She led Sarah to her office, which had large windows overlooking a small garden and 2 comfortable chairs positioned at an angle that felt conversational rather than clinical. "What brings you here today, Sarah?" Dr. Vasquez asked after they'd settled in their chairs. The question was so open-ended that Sarah found herself stumbling over where to begin. "I think I might be having some kind of anxiety problem, but I'm not sure if it's actually a problem or if I'm just not handling normal stress very well. Can you tell me more about what normal stress looks like in your life?" Sarah began describing her daily routine, intending to give a brief overview, but found herself providing a detailed account of her morning checklist, her afternoon schedule, her evening routine, and her weekend preparation strategies. As she talked, she watched Dr. Vasquez's expression, looking for signs of judgment or dismissal. Instead, she saw something that looked like recognition and compassion. "Sarah, you've just described managing what sounds like the equivalent of a small business operation, except that it runs 7 days a week. There are no breaks, and your performance directly affects the well-being of the people you love most. Does that sound like normal stress to you?" The reframing was so simple and so obvious that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "I never thought of it that way. How do you think of it?" "I think of it as just what mothers do, what wives do, what anyone would do if they cared about their family and wanted things to go well, and what happens inside your body and mind when things don't go according to plan." Sarah described the physical sensations she'd been noticing: the tight chest, the shallow breathing, the clenched jaw, the trembling hands. As she talked, Dr. Vasquez nodded with the recognition of someone who had heard similar stories many times before. "Those are classic anxiety responses, Sarah. Your nervous system is treating daily household disruptions as if they were genuine emergencies. That's exhausting for your body and your mind, but they feel like emergencies when they're happening. Like if I don't handle everything perfectly, something terrible will happen to my family." "What kind of terrible thing do you imagine happening?" The question forced Sarah to articulate fears she'd never spoken aloud. "I don't know exactly. That my children will feel insecure, or that David will get frustrated with the chaos and stop appreciating what I do for the family, or that other people will judge us as dysfunctional. That if I'm not constantly vigilant and managing everything perfectly, our whole life will fall apart." Have you ever tested that theory? Have there been times when you let something slide or when plans changed unexpectedly? Sarah thought about the pancake dinner earlier that week and how much joy it had brought to the evening despite, or maybe because of, abandoning her usual routine. Actually, yes. A few nights ago, my husband had to work late and I completely changed our dinner plans. We ended up having breakfast food and watching a movie, and the kids loved it. Nothing fell apart. How did you feel during that evening? Happy. Really happy in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. But then afterward, I started worrying about all the things that didn't get done because we changed the schedule. Dr. Vasquez smiled gently. What you're describing sounds like perfectionism, combined with something called hypervigilance, a state where your mind is constantly scanning for potential problems to solve. It's actually a trauma response, even though the trauma might be as simple as growing up with the message that your worth depends on how well you take care of others. The word trauma felt too big for Sarah's experience. She hadn't survived anything dramatic or obviously damaging. Her childhood had been stable, her marriage was loving, and her children were healthy and happy. I don't think I have trauma, she said carefully. Trauma doesn't always look like major catastrophic events. Sometimes it's the accumulation of small messages that teach us we're only valuable when we're useful to others, or that love has to be earned through perfect performance. Does any of that resonate with you? Sarah found herself thinking about her own mother, who had been a wonderful parent, but who had often praised Sarah most enthusiastically when she was being helpful or achieving something. She thought about teachers who had rewarded her for being the responsible student who could be counted on to complete every assignment perfectly. She thought about David's grateful comments about how she managed their household and how much of her identity had become tied to being indispensable. I think maybe I learned that being perfect was the way to make sure people loved me and needed me. And now you're exhausted from trying to maintain that level of perfection, but you're afraid that letting go of it means letting go of your value to your family. The insight hit Sarah like a physical sensation, as if something tight in her chest had suddenly loosened. Yes, that's exactly what I'm afraid of. They talked for the remaining 30 minutes about what healing might look like, learning to tolerate uncertainty, practicing self-compassion, setting boundaries around her time and energy, and gradually testing whether her family's love was really conditional on her perfect performance. As Sarah walked back to her car after the appointment, she felt something she couldn't immediately identify. It took her several minutes to realize it was relief, the profound comfort of having someone understand her experience and validate that her struggles were real and treatable. She sat in her car for a few minutes before starting the engine, looking at the small garden outside Dr. Vasquez's office. The plants were obviously cared for, but they weren't perfectly manicured. Some flowers were spent, some leaves were yellowing, and there were gaps where plants had finished their growing season. It was still beautiful, still obviously tended with love, but it was allowed to be imperfect and seasonal and real. Maybe, Sarah thought, that was what she needed to learn about her own life. The drive home took her past the elementary school, where pickup wouldn't begin for another hour. Instead of using the time for errands, she decided to stop at a bookstore she'd been meaning to visit. She spent 20 minutes wandering the fiction section, not looking for anything specific, but simply remembering what it felt like to be curious about stories that had nothing to do with parenting or home organization. She bought a novel, something she hadn't done in years, and tucked it into her purse like a small act of rebellion against her own expectations. When she picked up the children that afternoon, Emma noticed something different immediately. "Mom, you look, I don't know, calmer? Do I? I had a good afternoon. What did you do?" "I went for a walk, and I talked to someone about some things that have been on my mind, and I bought a book." Michael looked up from his backpack, where he was searching for the art project he'd mentioned that morning. "What kind of book?" "A storybook, just for fun." "Can you read it to us?" Sarah laughed, realizing that the book she'd chosen was definitely not appropriate for children. "This one is for grown-ups, but maybe we can find some new books for you guys too." As they drove home, Sarah felt the familiar urge to start planning the evening's activities, but she caught herself and took a deep breath instead. Tonight, she decided, she would make dinner without consulting 3 different sources to ensure nutritional balance. She would let the children play while she cooked, instead of organizing their activities down to the minute. She would leave the lunch boxes to be packed in the morning, instead of preparing them immediately after dinner. Small changes, but they felt revolutionary. That evening, as she tucked Emma into bed, her daughter asked, "Mum, are you going to keep talking to that person who helps you with things that are on your mind?" "I think so, sweetheart. Why?" Because I like how you seem when you're not worried about everything being perfect. You're more fun when you're just being mom. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead, thinking about how wise children could be when adults were brave enough to listen to them. I like being just mom too. I think I forgot how to do that for a while. Later that night, after David had gone to sleep, Sarah sat in their bedroom with her new book and read the first chapter. It was a simple pleasure, but it felt like the beginning of remembering who she was beyond her roles as wife and mother and household manager. For the first time in months, she went to sleep without reviewing the next day's schedule in her mind. Instead, she thought about Dr. Vasquez's words about trauma being the accumulation of messages that taught her worth was conditional on performance. Tomorrow, she would practice believing that she was lovable exactly as she was, imperfections and all. It would take time, she knew. Years of perfectionism couldn't be undone in a single therapy session. But she had taken the first step, and that felt like enough for today. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah could hear the sound of her family breathing peacefully around her, David beside her, the children in their rooms down the hall. They were safe, they were loved, and they would still be safe and loved even if she let go of her need to control every detail of their lives. The house settled around them with small creaking sounds, and Sarah found them comforting rather than concerning for the first time in months. Some things were beyond her control, and maybe that was okay. Maybe that was even beautiful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to practice being imperfect, to choose connection over control, to remember that love didn't have to be earned through flawless performance. She was ready to begin that work, one small, brave choice at a time. The woman who had started the day dreading her therapy appointment fell asleep looking forward to the journey of rediscovering herself, confident that she was worth the effort it would take to heal. The end. This story explores themes of perfectionism, maternal anxiety, and the courage required to seek help when the pursuit of perfection becomes self-destructive. Set in suburban Denver, it follows Sarah's journey from overwhelming perfectionism to the first steps of recovery, emphasizing that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom and self-compassion. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and if my story touched your heart today. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next confession. Give this video a like if it resonated with you, and share it with another woman who needs to know she's not alone. Together, our voices are stronger.